Good evening. Welcome, everyone, to this meeting of the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum. My name is Nelson Hoffman. I am a former member of the board of directors of the Faith and Science Forum and just helping out tonight. And I asked if I could have the privilege of introducing our speaker tonight. But before I do that, I would like to take a moment to thank our current president, the president of the board of the Faith and Science Forum, Kirk Weisbrod, who has played a crucial role during his less than a year in office, I believe, putting together this summer's presentations and actually doing the vast majority of the technical work to get this Zoom presentation going and the sound and video going tonight. I'd also like to introduce our past president of the board, Susan Sprake, who is busy right now actually running the Zoom presentation. Susan was board president for the past 3 years and did again, an excellent job in shepherding the cats and organizing the annual summer presentations of the forum. So I'd like to turn now to introducing our speaker tonight. Dr. Jack Shlachter is a physicist who worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory for over 30 years, with briefer stints at Brookhaven National Laboratory in New York, the Atomic Energy Agency, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. Those latter two organizations are based in Vienna, Austria. In parallel, Jack was ordained as a rabbi in 1995. He was the rabbi and spiritual leader for the Jewish congregation in Los Alamos for many years. Jack was the rabbi in Center Mauritius, New York, during his years at Brookhaven, and now serves as rabbi of Ha Makom, a congregation in Santa Fe, New Mexico, as well as the Los Alamos Jewish Center. He has also provided itinerant rabbinic support to far-flung Jewish communities around the world, including those in Vienna, Austria, Beijing, China, Warsaw, Poland, and Bangkok, Thailand. Now, before we welcome Jack, I want to read his title and abstract for his talk tonight. The title of his talk is Free Lunch or Free Will? The Jewish Texts and Modern Biology Address Voluntary Choice. And his abstract reads, "It appears that we can choose between a number of courses of action and thus become, through our choice, the cause of the action we select. Is this a true account of how we act, or are we compelled by God or by the laws of nature to act in such a way that we only appear to make choices freely?" In this talk, we'll explore the writings on the topic of free will by a variety of Jewish philosophers, both ancient and modern. We'll also examine some contemporary Jewish scientists' views on this challenging question. At the end of the talk, attendees will then get to choose what they believe, or will they? Please welcome Jack Shlachter.
Thank you, Mel. Just a question about audio. I think I'm wearing this, and that's supposed to be so that the people on Zoom can hear. Can everybody hear? Okay, all right. I'm going to give you this back, Nels. And I wanted to start with some thank yous also. Certainly, Kirk and Susan were acknowledged, but I need to acknowledge them too because they helped me tremendously to get everything ready for tonight. I don't think people realize how many hours Kirk puts into making Faith and Science a successful series. And Nels also was modest. He didn't mention himself, but he also has done a lot. Some of the other board members were playing roles behind the scenes that you may not have seen, but you did see Bob Dryja, and thank you to Bob for checking people in. Thank you to Bob Reinowski for the work that he's done. And that's my segue to Selma, who brought the desserts tonight. So thank you very much. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge my dear friends, Stephen and Suzanne Lynn and Marilyn Yeamans, who took the burden of providing the food for this evening off of my shoulders so that I could focus on being nervous about the talk. So thank you to Suzanne, Marilyn, and Stephen. And my wife actually did a lot of the arranging before she left town. So you can thank her when you see her, and you can also tell her the talk was great. That would be good too. So before I launch into the presentation, I want to make a few words about the food because it was a little tricky. It felt inappropriate for the Los Alamos Jewish Center people to make arrangements for the food and to provide food that traditionally Jewish people wouldn't be able to eat. That just somehow felt odd. And so I was asked if I would say a few words about what we call the laws of kashrut, or you're probably familiar with the word kosher, and what does that even mean? And I'm not trying to pretend that this food meets the standards of people who are particularly careful about kashrut, but we did try to be vegetarian because much of the laws having to do with dietary restrictions in Judaism have to do with meat. So if you take meat or animals out of the equation, you're on pretty solid ground. And because this is faith and science, I thought I would share with you a few texts on this topic of Jewish food restrictions. The first comes from the Maimonides, who we're going to see in this presentation also. And I spoke about him a few years ago as part of the Faith and Science series, but he's my go-to person. Maimonides, giant rabbi of about 850 years ago or so, died in 1204, I think. And this is from one of his texts, and we're going to look at this text also. And I was glad to see Norm Delamater here, because he and I have spoken about the Guide for the Perplexed before, and this comes from the Guide for the Perplexed. And Maimonides said, "The food which is forbidden by the 5 books of Moses, what we call the Torah, is unwholesome." So he is actually a scientist as well as a rabbi. And he says there is nothing among the forbidden kinds of food whose harmful character is doubted except pork and fat. So he's sort of saying that most of the things that we are forbidden to eat are not good for you, but apparently he knows that pork is probably okay for you, which is a little odd because most people would say the reason that that's forbidden is because of trichinosis or other problems. But he's not making that argument. Now, there are other commentaries who go on to say things like, this is from a sort of a commentary on Maimonides that says the ideological roots of this commandment may be traced to the fact that the body is the tool of the soul through which the latter accomplishes its functions, and without which it could never fulfill its task. And then it goes on to say that the plain sense reason for the dietary prohibitions is that when the body suffers some kind of disability, this affects the intellect as well. So in other words, the body and the mind are linked, and it's important to have a clear mind, and if you're not putting good food in your body. So those are kind of the rational approach to this topic about what you can eat and what you can't eat. And yet, now brace yourself. I see everybody is sitting. Jews don't agree on everything. And we're going to see that in the presentation tonight. So a counterpoint of view from a commentator from several hundred years ago says, we ought to bear in mind that the dietary laws are not, as some have asserted, motivated by therapeutic considerations. Were that so, the scripture, the Jewish Bible, would be reduced to the level of a minor medical treatise. I think he has a point. And then he goes on to say, moreover, the alleged ill effects can be treated with various drugs, or like with trichinosis, that we now know how to avoid that problem. In that event, the prohibition would no longer apply, and the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, would be rendered void. So he doesn't like this approach of trying to get to a scientific answer. And I'm just going to cut to the chase on this. And what it says in one of the commentaries on the book of Leviticus, probably a fairly ancient commentary, is one should not say, I dislike eating these foods that are forbidden, or I don't eat them because they are unhealthy. One should say, I actually would like to eat those, but I have trained myself not to do that because there is benefit in learning to constrain our desires. So this food was an attempt to acknowledge the importance of food in Judaism, and like I say, if you're vegetarian, it's pretty easy to follow the rules, and if you're not, they put lots of restrictions on which kind of animal, how the animal can be killed, how the animal's meat can be prepared, what you can eat it with, which dishes you can use. It gets very elaborate. In part, to me, it's because if we start to treat the destruction of animal life as no big deal, it's a slippery slope, and we will start to treat human life with a cavalier attitude. So that's what works for me personally, but the texts don't try to make that argument necessarily, or you can probably find some text that says that, but not all of them. And I appreciate those of you who were craving something that would satisfy your meat desires had to bear with our approach to using vegetarian food tonight. So I appreciate that. So let me launch into this talk. I bit off more than I could chew by choosing this topic of free will in Jewish sort of philosophical texts and also in modern neuroscience. What this talk ultimately boils down to, sort of bottom line up front, is that I am proud to be a Jew. This is a time in the world where anti-Semitism is sadly on the rise. You don't have to be a real student of the news to appreciate that this is a difficult time. Even in this country, wonderful as it has been to Jews historically, we have problems in this country. And so this talk is really just me being proud of a bunch of Jews and sharing with you what some of them had to say on this complex topic of free will. That was going to be the first half of the talk, and we have a tradition in Judaism of what we call a minyan, a majority, when we're able to do certain activities because we have enough adults, Jewish adults around, that we have a quorum, if you will. So a minyan is 10 adults. And I selected 10 philosophers because I thought that would make it a neat connection. It's too many. So I think some of them are going to get short shrift. We're just going to zip past them. And with the time that I put into putting this talk together, I hope this is not the last time I give the talk. So the work was probably not wasted. Then we're going to segue, though, to modern neuroscience and talk a little bit about what modern neuroscience has to tell us on this topic of free will. I am not a neuroscientist. Anybody here who has any biology background at all is probably going to balk at some of the explanations that I give about what's been done in the field of modern neuroscience and free will. But I will tell you that I didn't try to be selective about which neuroscientists I looked at, and yet almost every single one that I came across is Jewish. And so it fit this theme of I'm just taking pride in a bunch of Jews. Some were philosophers, some are scientists, and that's what this is all about. So the majority Jewish view is that people through choice have control over their actions. But the Hebrew Bible, what some people outside of Judaism call the Old Testament, we don't call it that because for us it's still the Testament. The Hebrew Bible is a record of what we call divine providence. And I looked to find out about what this word providence means, because I don't use that in polite conversation. And it comes from the Greek, and it means perceiving beforehand. So if it's divine providence, it's God knowing in advance what's going to happen. And that is one of the major issues that face the philosophers. How can you have free will if God knows in advance what's going to happen? So how do you reconcile free will and divine providence? That's a major issue for these Jewish philosophers. Later on, we're going to see that there is a conflict between these, and some philosophers try to address that. Whether you think they're successful or not is another story. So my clicker person is clicking for me, and there we go. Okay, so the literature on free will is vast. This is why I say I bit off more than I could chew. I really have been pouring through way too many things over the last few months after I said I wanted to do this topic. But there's a core text from the Bible, from the 5 books of Moses, from the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse, choose life. It makes it sound like the 5 books of Moses, kind of the earliest Jewish text, has an understanding of free will. And then we're going to see that modern neuroscientists sort of have mixed conclusions, but I would say largely are leaning towards it's an illusion that we have free will. So next one. So just to remind you, free will, I mean that we're able to choose from a range of possible courses of action. We're able to choose which one we want to deploy. And Jewish philosophers largely believe that this is an important part of our understanding of how the world works, because otherwise you have this problem with how can you be held morally responsible for your actions if you don't control your actions. That is a hard one to swallow. So generally, the philosophers buy into the idea of free will. And then a few definitions, because if you get into this topic, you come across lots of verbiage. Not only don't I know any biology, but I don't know any philosophy either, which makes my friend Vicky kind of cringe because she knows philosophy and I probably use these terms incorrectly or whatever. But here's some definitions that I came across, that there are people who deny the existence of free will. And if they're, well, so those people are called determinists, right? They believe that everything is determined. And if these people who believe that there is no free will believe that it's incompatible with free will that people could have acted, differently than the way they acted, they're hard determinists. So it's like within the category of determinists, we have the hard determinists. Then we have the soft determinists. As you can imagine, those are called the compatibilists. And these are modern terms, but you can read back into the medieval philosophers and say, oh, this guy is actually just what we would today call a soft determinist or whatever. So the soft determinists or compatibilists believe that free will and determinism are compatible, and they usually get to that by weakening the definition of free will, right? we might take a broad definition of free will and say, you can choose anything, and maybe a narrower definition is you don't have that much choice, but you have some choice, and that's these soft determinists. Okay, next slide. You can click again, actually. Okay, keep clicking, one more. Yeah, I was motivated by our professional speaker who came in last week to put some animation in a presentation, and I hate using animation, so I threw it in there, but I think we're not going to get too much of that. So this is the first individual who writes as an individual by name. You know him as the inventor of flaky dough. Philo? No, I'm just kidding. So you have his dates up there. Again, a little sensitivity about Jews often referring to the same years that everybody else refers to, but we say before the Common Era rather than BC, and instead of AD, we say the Common Era, but the numbering is the same. So we're talking about somebody who lived 2,000 years ago, and that is not a photograph of him. I know you'll be shocked to hear that. That was something made in 1584 as a very creative illustration, because we have no idea what this guy looked like. His writings are very important because he lived in Alexandria, hence his name, Philo of Alexandria, and he absorbed the Greek wisdom of his era because he was living immersed in that society. His writings, I should just have you know, that most traditional Jewish academics or whatever don't look at him so much because he really didn't play much of a role in subsequent Jewish understanding of things. His writings were preserved, but only because of the church. And now, you can get this stuff. Everything that I'm going to quote today is English translations of things, and it's all out there. It's easy to access now. But you can go to the next one. You know what? I must have animated a few more before I gave up. So he's not consistent. I mean, he does talk about free will, but he's not very consistent in what he has to say about it. So some places he says we can choose between good and evil, and other places he says there's predetermination. So he didn't really reject determinism, but he didn't embrace it either, and so he kind of hedged his bets. One scholar I read said that he dodges the question. And really, many people do dodge the question because it's pretty hard to figure out how to resolve all this. So we're going to move, now we're going to take a big jump about 900 years in the future. And here we have Saadia Gaon. So his name is Saadia, the son of somebody, but Gaon is a title. He was the academy head in the city of Sura, which was in what we called Babylonia, what is now Iraq. And he wrote a work called the Book of Beliefs and Opinions, and he really tried to integrate Jewish theology with ancient Greek philosophy. Now, that was done by his predecessor that I mentioned, but not real systematically. Saadia tries to do it systematically. I put some historical things about these individuals because if I were just to read from their works, we would all be asleep in no time because it's very dense. And, I read a book about reading medieval Jewish philosophy that says you have to expect to go at no more than 1/10 the rate that you would normally read a book, because you just can't absorb the material quickly. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time quoting these people, but I like some of the history about them. He had a very important role pushing back against a group of people who we call the Karaites. They get their name because they were really fundamentalists. They believed that the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was a divine work, but everything after that is man-made, and they ignore it all. And so that is not normative Judaism today. We embrace many other texts that go well beyond the Hebrew Bible. If it was just the Hebrew Bible, my wife would be happier because our house would only have about, 24 books in it instead of 7,500 and counting. Because there's many text strands in Judaism, and the Talmud is a major one. The Karaites did not accept that the Talmud was important, and he pushed back against them. If you go to the next one, he also had a very important role. Jews are found all over the world. Now, there aren't very many. Jews make up about 0.2% of the population of the world. That is like pretty negligible. But they're almost everywhere, or they have lived almost everywhere because of being booted out by the Romans 2,000 years ago. And Saadia was the one who really established Babylonia as the pinnacle of Jewish academic work in his era. And so the fact that he established this academy in Sura was very important for raising Babylonia to the heights that it became. And I want to read a little bit from Saadia, not much. But this comes from that work that I mentioned, the Book of Beliefs and Opinions. He says, God has told us that God has granted to people the capacity to obey God and has left it to people to act on it and has given people freedom of choice, but enjoined them to choose the good. And then he quotes from Deuteronomy, the quote that I had before, that we're offered the choice and we should choose life. So he cites that passage, and as far as where he stands on this issue of free will, he can't imagine that we would be forced to do something and then get punished for it later. That is this dilemma about how can you be held responsible if you have no choice in what you do. So you can hear him expressing some understanding of free will there. All right. Our next one, I didn't have a picture of him. Actually, if you noticed in the previous one, that was a street sign in Tel Aviv that says Rehov Saadia Gaon, the street of Saadia Gaon. I love walking around Tel Aviv because you just learn so much Jewish history in the process, because the streets are named not after Lincoln Avenue or Washington Boulevard, but after, and we have lots of years to come up with a lot of street names. So that was a street sign of Saadia Gaon Street. Here I have an image of the work by this individual, Bachya ibn Pakuda. The ibn, like Ben, means son of, because people really just had one name and then were known by their patronymic usually. So he's now, look where he is. He's in Spain. So you see, there are multiple regions with important Jewish scholars, and he has a different environment that he's writing from, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce which of the Islamic philosophies he was rejecting, but he became an adherent of this sort of mystical Islamic tradition that was familiar to him in southern Spain at this time by the Muslim Sufis. And he wrote a book, like everybody has to write a book, right? So he wrote a book, Guidance to the Duties of the Heart. And this is a comment about his reflection on free will in that book. While man has the freedom to will and choose, the realization of his actions is dependent on God's will. To me, that's a little bit of waffling, but okay. That's what he has to say. Now, this work, the Guidance to the Duties of the Heart, you might wonder, well, what does that title even mean? So he is trying to distinguish duties of the heart from duties of the body. And he says duties of the body, these are ritual and ethical practices, like keeping kosher, like what we eat. That would be a duty of the body. He says, duties of the heart are the attitudes and intentions that determine the state of a person's soul and alone give value to his acts. So he thinks that his predecessors were focused very heavily on duties of the body. You find vast volumes about what you can eat and what you can't eat, or how to observe the Sabbath, or marital relations. All these practical books, if you will, duties of the body. But he felt that what was lacking was something that systematized duties of the heart, and that's what he set out to write. And he divided the work into 10 gates, as he called them. And if you go to the next one, so the fourth gate is called Sha'ar HaBitachon, the gate of trust, I guess is the right way to translate that. And here he says that there are people who believe that everything is predetermined by God, and there are people who believe that people have free will. And he says this is not a question that can be answered. But he does say, and I like this, because to me this is a way to resolve it in your practical daily existence. People should conduct themselves like a person who believes that their actions are in their own hands, that we have control, and at the same time trust in God like one who is certain that his actions are predetermined. So he's hedging it, but he's telling you how to live your life. Live your life like you have free will, and live your life like there is a God that you can trust who has those kind of powers. So I wanted to read just a little snippet from that work, The Duties of the Heart. And he quotes again from Deuteronomy, because you see the same texts used over and over. See, I have set before you this day life and death, therefore choose life. This all points to the fact that people's actions are entrusted to themselves alone, and God has nothing to do with your good nature or good deeds, your evil nature or evil deeds. However, this matter is very difficult for me, and the reconciliation of two opposites is very difficult. So if there is a cure for this malady, I wish God would cure me of it. So he doesn't know how to get out of this one either, right? All right, our next one. And if you're keeping count, I think this is number 5, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to try to, no, I think he might only be 4. All right, so that is a statue of Yehuda HaLevi, Judah the Levite. Now you see that there's some question exactly where he was born, but probably somewhere in Spain, certainly in what we would call the West. And you see that there's a question about where he died, and some would say Jerusalem. Why is that? Because he was given this message, according to his writings, that he leaves Spain to settle in the country of his dreams. He was a very early Zionist, and he went at the age of 60 from Spain, heading to Jerusalem. There is a legend that he was trampled to death by an Arab horseman when he arrived in Jerusalem. That is probably a legend. Most modern scholars think that he probably died elsewhere, not that he didn't make it to Jerusalem. Nevertheless, we associate him with the very early stirrings of a return to the land of Israel. He wrote a very famous poem called Ode to Zion, and it's got beautiful opening line about my heart is in the east, referring to Jerusalem, but I am stuck here in the west, right? And so it's very Zionistic in its outlook. He wrote an amazing book called the Kuzari. So the Kuzari is, I think, also a legend of this tribe called the Khazars, where the head of the tribe decided he's going to figure out what's the right tradition for his people, and he's going to interview different individuals from the different traditions. And so so you can go to the next one, according to, what am I doing? Okay. Oh, maybe I didn't make a slide for this. Okay. in any case, he does maintain there's no contradiction between free choice and the view that that God knows in advance what will happen. And I'm going to read you a passage about that. But I want to tell you about this work first, the Kuzari. So in the Kuzari, this heathen tribe, so they have like no tradition right now, the king decides that he wants to find out what they should all become. And first he, interviews a Christian sage and then a Muslim sage, and then he finally interviews a Jewish sage. And the book is written like this dialogue between this fictitious Jewish sage and this probably fictitious leader of the Khazars. And when all is said and done, the Khazars convert to Judaism. That's the legend, okay? And you probably have not read the Kuzari since it was written, 1,000 years ago or something. But Arthur Koestler wrote a book called The 13th Tribe that is about that same legend. So, that legend hasn't disappeared from us. So I'm going to read to you a passage from the Kuzari, and it says as follows. If you seek the causes of these processes, active as well as passive, you will not fail to discover them. And this is part of this dialogue between the Jewish sage and this king. You may even discover the causes of their causes till you arrive at the spheres, then at their causes, and finally at the prime cause. One might justly say that everything is ordained by God, and another is equally right in making man's free will or accident responsible for it, without, however, bringing it outside the divine providence. Free will belongs to the class of intermediary causes and possesses causes which reduce it chain-like to the prime cause. Now, that's kind of classic philosophical jargon, but we're going to hear that same thing in modern neuroscience. So hold that thought. Okay, now I think I'm going to have to do some skipping. So let's keep going. This is Abraham ibn Dawud, Dawud like David, if you will, but from a Muslim environment. And he says that free will is somewhat limited. And he wrote a philosophical work called The Exalted Faith. And in a book about medieval Jewish philosophy, I read many years ago that if you're going to embark on a study of medieval Jewish philosophy, you should start with The Exalted Faith because it's so clearly written. Don't jump into the Guide for the Perplexed, for example, right? So this was a modern scholar who said, start with The Exalted Faith. I think this guy was pulling my leg. I'm going to read to you a passage from The Exalted Faith, which I bought years and years ago and probably had never taken off the shelf until starting to prepare for this talk, and now I can see why I put it back on the shelf. Concerning what exists without being guarded and what is delivered into the evil of one's own choice, the following is said. And now this is a very important biblical passage, which we hadn't come across before, only because I'm not sharing everything that you read. But this is the passage in the book of Exodus where it says that God says, I will harden the heart of Pharaoh. That sounds like a little bit of predetermination, right? If Pharaoh's heart is hardened by an external cause, namely by God, then Pharaoh doesn't have free will and keeps the Jews as slaves through the succession of plagues that we recognize with the holiday of Passover. But he cites that and he says, I will harden the heart of Pharaoh, for God has hardened his spirit, which means being forsaken and abandoned after the going forth of the principle of evil from the heart of man. Concerning the providence that follows for those who entrust their spirit with God, the prophet cries out, saying, Why, O Lord, do you make us err from our ways, hardening our heart from the fear to you, that is, being forsaken and abandoned to bad advice? When you investigate all of the verses seemingly about predestination, you will see that all of them depart this way. Know concerning belief in choice that our ancestors said, And now he's going to quote from the Talmud. And this is a very important line that is often cited. In the Talmud it says, Rabbi Hanina said, Hakol biyodei shamayim chutz yirat shamayim. Everybody okay with that? No, I'll translate it. So, Hakol biyodei shamayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven, meaning, it's all determined by God. Chutz, except, mi yirat shamayim, for the fear of heaven. So there's like this finesse in the Talmud that everything is in God's hands except whether you choose to recognize God or not, or something like that, right? But that is a kind of a classic workaround for this dilemma. And that passage that I read comes from the Exalted Faith. That's on page 250. So now I only have 249 more pages to go, because this comes right at the end. We can go on. Oh, Sefer HaKabbalah, which was what was pictured there, is not a work of philosophy. But in Sefer HaKabbalah, it's a book of tradition. That's what that means. In fact, you see that title there, Sefer HaKabbalah, the book of tradition. He recounts a legend, which is a great legend. It says that there were 4 rabbis in Babylonia. So remember, the Jews were in Israel, and then they scattered, and we had Jews living in Egypt, and then they scattered, and we had Jews living in Babylonia, and now, how did they end up in Spain? There's in Sefer HaKabbalah, there's a tale of 4 rabbis that were in Babylonia, which was the pinnacle of Jewish scholarship for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they were traveling on a ship in the Mediterranean, and the ship sunk. And the 4 rabbis were rescued by pirates and sold into slavery, and they were sold into different parts of the Mediterranean. And the story is that one of those rabbis was sold into slavery in Cordova in Spain, and the Jewish community there redeemed him. They paid to free him, and he started going to classes, and people were amazed. This guy knows like tons of stuff that we don't even know, and they made him their leader in Spain, and that is how, I love this quote, this transferred the crown of Torah, the crown of Jewish learning, from Babylonia to Spain. Now, I'm sure that's just a legend, but the rabbis in Spain wanted to kind of pump up their importance, and as you see, Ibn Daud lived in Spain, and now we go to our next individual, and that is Maimonides. So Maimonides was born in Spain, and is considered by some to have been the greatest rabbi, of all time. And I love this statement. If one did not know that Maimonides was the name of a man, one would assume it was the name of a university, because the guy was so prolific. I mean, he wrote 10 medical treatises. That was his profession. He was a physician. And my little joke up there, maybe even a plasma physicist. But he was, he was an astronomer. He was a philosopher. He really was he knew Jewish law inside and out. He was the personal physician of Saladin, and he finesses this in an interesting way. So let's go to the next one. So yeah, he wrote 3 very important works. One of them is a commentary on the Mishnah. He wrote that in his early life, probably in his 20s. In his middle years, he wrote something called the Mishnah Torah, which is this collection of Jewish laws where he extracted from the Talmud the answers. The Talmud is filled with arguments, like, are we supposed to do this or do that? And arguments are given both ways, and then a third point of view comes in, and we get page after page after page of arguments. But somebody says, okay, but I just want to know what's the answer. So Maimonides extracted all these answers into a slim 14-volume work called the Mishnah Torah. And in the Mishnah Torah, which he wrote in easy to understand Hebrew, because he really wanted it disseminated, he wrote that every person may choose to do good or evil. And he recognized that there's this problem of reconciling that with God's omniscience, but he said it's outside of human understanding how you resolve this, but for sure everybody has free will. Now, he had to say that in the Mishnah Torah because that was widely disseminated. He knew this would be read by the masses. He was a bit of an elitist, so he wrote another work later in his life. This is the Guide for the Perplexed, which he wrote in a more cryptic way. It was in Arabic, which was not read by the masses, and it was really intended, it's kind of like you need the code book to understand the Guide for the Perplexed. That's why it's not a good thing to pick up, and just try to read it. But in that, he says that the fact that God knows what will happen does not in any way abrogate man's free will. God's knowledge does not bring about the actualization of one of the two possibilities. And he knows that if people believe they don't have free will, we could have a bad society. And the modern neuroscientists are aware of that issue also. If people start to believe that they have no choice, then there's no reason to be held accountable and just do whatever you feel like doing because that's what you were going to do anyway. I'm going to share with you just a little passage from the Guide of the Perplexed to sum up the notion that I have stated. Just as we do not apprehend the true reality of God's essence, but know that God's existence is the most perfect of existences, so also we do not know the true reality of his knowledge because it is God's essence. We do know that God does not apprehend at certain times while being ignorant at others, so there's no new knowledge that comes to him. But the contradictions that may appear in the union of these assertions is due to their being considered in relation to our knowledge, which has only its name in common with God's knowledge. In other words, we're limited by our vocabulary to say God has knowledge, we have knowledge, it must be the same kind of thing. But he says, no, it's just a shorthand because we can't understand God's knowledge. So let's go on. Okay, this guy, Gersonides, I couldn't find a street sign handy, but you see an Israeli stamp. So, even if you collect stamps, you come across these great individuals. But most important with this stamp is you see that he's doing some astronomy measurements. And what I have read is that using data that Gersonides collected from his own observations, and notice when he lived, 1288 to 1344, he refuted Ptolemy's model in one of the most important insights in the history of science, which is generally missed in telling the story of the transition from epicyclic corrections, this is Ptolemy's epicycles around epicycles to explain the observations and the motions of the planets, to the geocentric model of Copernicus's heliocentric model. And so Gersonides predated that. And according to scholars who read Gersonides' writings, he understood from his observations that the sun must be the center of the solar system. Has nothing to do with free will, but just an interesting passage. And he takes a different tack. It says, according to one of the students of Gersonides, that he was bothered by this question of God's foreknowledge and human freedom. And he says God does not know which choice the individual will make. So he comes down pretty clearly that God's knowledge is limited in a sense. All right, let's go to the next one. I actually attended an online class this morning called Free Will and Kabbalah. I mean, how they happened to schedule that thing this morning, I don't know. But one of the points that the instructor made is that we talk about genetics, and genetics being like predetermining a lot of things for us, but it's not so different from people who believe in astrology and believe that it's all determined, just maybe not in our bodies, but in the stars. And so the free will, he says, the free will could shatter the course of action ordained by the stars. So even though a lot of it is set in motion, there are things you can do that'll get you out of that. Okay, I'm going to skip over all the next philosophers because, and just so you know who we're skipping over, Chastai Crescus, he thinks, sort of like Maimonides, that the masses should not know that they don't have free will, because then all chaos will break loose. But they should believe that there's punishment for the choices that you make. That's him. Spinoza. Back up just a little bit because I just want to catch these individuals by name. Spinoza may be a name familiar to you. Einstein named Spinoza as the philosopher who exerted the most influence on his worldview. There was a telegram that was sent to Einstein whether Einstein believed in God, and Einstein wrote back, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists, not in a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings." So it's kind of this limited theology, if you will. Okay, we pass over Spinoza. I wanted to get us to the 1800s at least, to somebody who one of my congregants in Santa Fe really likes, the Ishbitzer. We're going to skip over him. We're going to skip over Kabbalah, except to say that I put the cover of the book Life of Pi on there. How many have read the Life of Pi? So, okay, here's the quiz question for you. What was the name of the boat that sank? It was called Tzimtzum. Why is it called Tzimtzum? Because that's a Kabbalistic word. Tzimtzum is God's choice to limit God's self. Because if God fills the universe, there's no room for anything else. So how do we have people and animals and planets and all that? Kabbalah came up with this idea of Tzimtzum, a contraction of God, and that is the name given to the boat in the Life of Pi. Go figure. Okay, so that's one way. Again, this self-limiting of God is a way to resolve this conflict between predestination and free will. This is a scattering of modern philosophers just to show that even after we get through the 10, there's still more, and they have a mixed bag. I'm going to do the neuroscience quite quickly and then give time for questions, and then we'll have table discussions. So neuroscience, yet another topic I know nothing about. That will become quite apparent, but much of the modern understanding of the neuroscience basis for our perception of free will goes back to an individual whose name is Benjamin Libet. I don't think there's any dispute that Libet's experiments were absolutely key to the field of neuroscience and free will. And you guessed it, he was Jewish. He did these experiments in the 1980s, and the gist of the experiments, actually, I have to show you a graphic, so go to the next slide. Well, there's Benjamin Libet, and his conclusion, even though his experiments are often used as the neuroscience basis for saying we have no free will, he concluded from them that free will is at least as good an understanding, if not a better understanding, as a scientific option than its denial by determinist theory. And he wrote that many years after his seminal experiments in the early 80s. But I have to show you this graphic that I was able to find. Is it going to work? Yes, look at that. Is that amazing? I mean, I don't know how I found this on the web, but this is supposed to be the experiment. And there are 4 different times, 0, 1, 2, and 3. So it cycles through. There's 0, there's 1, there's 2, and there's 3. So what's going on? A person has electrodes connected to their scalp, and they are told to do the following experiment. You are supposed to push, you see they're pushing like watch the finger there. So you see the index finger moves, right? They're told to move their index finger whenever they want. Whenever they want. And they can do it any number of times. But They're supposed to be looking at a clock at the same time that they're going to be making this decision to move their finger, and they're supposed to note what time it is when they make the decision to move their finger, which is going to be before they move their finger, right? You make the decision to move your finger, and then you move your finger. But he's looking with electrodes, and the electrodes say that before you make the decision, something happened in your brain. That's what this experiment is all about. Everything else is just floss on this, but what's really going on is that you think that nothing's happening, and then there's a recording on the electrode of a signal in your brain, and then you note the time later, like maybe 200 milliseconds later, that you made the decision, and then your finger moves. This was very important. And everything stems from these kind of experiments, these Libet-type experiments. Now, if you go to the next slide, so this is what he had to say about it, and I think it's actually quite interesting. He said this kind of, so what is it that's happening? Stuff is ballistic in your brain. The decision about moving your finger has already been launched, but what you can do is decide not to follow that. And so he says this kind of role for free will is actually in accord with religious and ethical strictures, because most of the commandments are don't do something, right? And that's actually quite interesting. Maimonides made a listing of the Jewish commandments. It's not the 10 Commandments. That's why we don't encourage people to become Jewish, because all you do is take on a whole bunch of commandments. You don't want to do that. There are 613 traditional commandments in Judaism, but you know what? There's a lot more do-nots than do's. So he's right that really controlling yourself, not doing something, is the bulk of what drives Judaism. And I love this statement. He says, conscious volition is exercised in the form of the power of veto, what he calls free won't. And that actually is the neuroscientific workaround for the Libet experiments by those minority neuroscientists who believe that you still have some control. Most neuroscientists, I think, believe that these experiments are the nail in the coffin for free will. But Libet did not believe that, and Libet came up with this idea of free won't. And I think that's fascinating. We're going to zip to the next few individuals. These are standard neuroscientists who argue that there is no free will based on Libet-type experiments. One of them pictured on the left one of them pictured on the left is Robert Sapolsky holding a copy of the book Determined. I read the book Determined, sadly, just before Faith and Science Board said, who has a topic for our series? And I thought, yeah, okay, I'll talk about this. There was a big mistake. But anyway, he is a neuroscientist who says these experiments are definitive. There is no free will. Sam Harris also says there's no free will. Both of them are Jewish and extant. Christopher Hitchens, who died in 2011, also didn't believe there was free will. Christopher Hitchens, who would think? Nope, he was Jewish too. Jerry Allen Coyne, another major biologist and skeptic of free will, also Jewish. So a lot of Jewish scientists and a lot of neuroscientists believing there's no free will. Now we go on, because Sapolsky was actually raised in a very traditional household, and he recently reported that when he was a teenager, he woke up at 2 a.m. one morning. It was the morning after they did the reading from the 5 books of Moses about God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And he recounts that he says, I get it. There's no God and there's no free will. As a teenager, that was his conclusion. So you go on. I got in touch with him when I decided I was going to do this talk. This is a quote from the email that he sent me. And he says, every time somebody who believes that there's free will says that neurons have spontaneous action potentials, he says this is not true. This is neuroscientifically not true. It's not that a nerve just decides to go, right? It's all predetermined. But I pressed him some more, go to the next slide, and I said, okay, I see maybe what you're saying neuroscientifically, but what about atheism? And he actually went on to say at the end there, I have zero intellectual basis for my atheism. It's entirely emotional. I'm surprised he didn't say, I don't get to choose. I just don't believe that there's a God, but that's not how he answered it. Okay, go on. We are in the home stretch. I wanted to find some individuals who don't buy into this. So some individuals say that the Libet experiments are flawed because telling somebody, tap your finger, and that's what we're going to study. It's an unimportant decision. Who cares whether you tap your finger now or 5 seconds from now? It makes no difference. But what if you're making a decision about something important, like who should I marry or should I take a different job? These neuroscientists, who I believe are a minority, believe that there is some determination that you make on these important decisions, and the Libet experiments don't test that sort of thing. So, okay, that's another perspective. Let's go on. Oh, and every one of these scientists that I came across, I mean, this one, it's not even somebody necessarily that great, but I'm reading the biography. She is also a member of Temple Emmanuel in Providence, Rhode Island. It's like, okay, if the name wasn't enough for me, I managed to find yet another Jewish scientist. And the next one, this woman as well, I found the wedding announcement from her marriage, and it was conducted by Rabbi so-and-so. I mean, there's pretty good evidence. Let's skip to the next. This might, okay. And then this guy, Uri Maoz, was educated at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and got his bachelor's and his PhD there, and he's currently on the faculty at Chapman University. He also wrote back to me when I wrote to him, and he sent me a couple of articles to read and a book that he has published that he recommended. But, I can't prove that he's Jewish because I didn't come out and ask him. And he's fairly young, so there's not like a ton of literature out there. But Uri Maoz, educated in Jerusalem, I think we can guess. All right, so I'm going to leave this up for a moment. Can everybody see that? I'm going to leave that up for a few moments. This is on his website. Oh, sorry. If this works, you will start laughing. I thought this was very clever on his website, right? So he's a professor and he studies free will. And he puts this paragraph out there, and it's like, if you get to the end of it, you're sort of troubled. Did you really have a choice about reading the whole thing or not? Anyway, I thought this was very funny. So I think we're at the end. Let's see. So we conclude with the following statement: we must believe in free will. We have no choice. I wanted to end with something very positive, however. So I read the book Determined by Robert Sapolsky. I thought it was pretty convincing, but again, I don't know any neuroscience. And then, I started to read these other things that say, well, that's an oversimplification. Those experiments are trivial experiments, blah, blah, blah. However, I found something interesting. By reading that book, at least for a few weeks, I think I was a slightly nicer person than I normally am because I cut people some slack. I figured, okay, they really didn't have a choice whether they said that to me that I took offense at, or they did something that I was not so happy about. And frankly, that is my bottom line. Whether or not we have free will, I have no idea. But if we act like people are kind of set in their ways, maybe we cut them a little slack. And if we act like we have free will, maybe we act as good as we can possibly be. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
Vicky. Uh-oh, I'm in trouble.
Okay, so in 1965, Libet measures the neural switch. Take me from that trivial piece of lab rat ideology to an ethics of compassion. Neural twitches do not equate to ethical free will.
Yes, so Vicki
No.
is absolutely right that this is the criticism by those who, I will say, who want to believe that we have some free will. They criticize those experiments, as you say, they're just little twitches, right? That's not making a profound decision. But you know, Sapolsky talks about serving as an expert witness in a trial of an individual who grows up with a mother who was taking crack when he was in utero, who had no father, who grew up in a disadvantaged household, who had no figures to provide him with guidance, and then say, you're responsible for your action. He thinks that's unconscionable. How could this person don't do anything but what they did? They were on a trajectory that never could have deviated. And it's so easy for us, you know, in middle class, whatever, to adjudicate a case like that. He finds that inappropriate. He does not believe that society will break down if people understand that neuronal processes really have causes that are driving them. He thinks you can still be ethical. He's not saying that the experiment says something directly about ethics, but he's saying that the experiment says what the experiment says. Anytime you think that you have some control, just trace the neurons back. Something fired that made that thing fire. But that doesn't mean you can't live an ethical life.
Okay, you remember when Andrew Newberg came last year? Andrew Newberg, and he did the biology of religious
I barely remember my name.
Okay, well, he did. Trust me, he was here. All right, when we were over at Sala. And he was talking about the brain scans of people who are meditating. So it's the biological basis of mysticism, and it turns out you get the same result from being a crackhead.
So is this...
So
is this
why are we looking at neuroscience? We're looking in the wrong place, asking the wrong questions. If you cannot tell me the difference between a mystic and a crackhead, between a schizophrenic brain scan and a normal teenager brain scan, which explains some of the problems for those years, right? Neuroscience is not helpful.
Fair enough. When we can continue that offline. Chick, and he's got a microphone for you.
So 2 points, one philosophical and one scientific. The conundrum that a lot of these people had was, how can God, who knows everything, da-da-da-da? And the answer to that is, when you look at all the science, the age of the universe and everything else, God doesn't know the future. It hasn't happened yet, so it's not, that does not constrain his knowledge. It just hasn't happened yet. So he's very interested to see what you're going to do. Scientifically, I'm pretty much convinced by a book, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was by Stanislaus Dehaene. If you can remember Stanislaus Dehaene, a lot of scientific studies comparing unconscious with conscious and how that all works. He comes to the conclusion that, of course, we have free will. Your unconscious looks at lots of things, presents to you only a few of them, makes a decision, and then you make a decision from those. And so there's, from his scientific studies, you know, all the brain, he looks at all the brain and everything else. I really recommend trying to find this book by Stanislaus Dehaene. It's very convincing. And the science that he's done says, sure, you got free will, of course.
Thanks. You know, I was trying to find some passage that I read, but I can't find it right away. But if you're standing on a mountaintop, which is what was described in this one thing, and you see two trains that are at, 90 degrees to each other, and they're both heading for the same point, you know they're going to crash. You're not determining that ahead of time, but you're not, it's that sort of situation, right? You can see what's going to happen, but you're not the one determining that. Or, for example, when we read about the Battle of Waterloo, we know the outcome. We're not changing what's going to happen, but we read that story. It's like we know where it's going to go, but we're not the ones determining that.
When you were talking about Libet, what came to my mind that much of my life I believe in the Ten Commandments are very nice, but they're in the wrong order. Before a priori, I go to the ninth and 10th commandment, to sin or not to sin, that is the question. And hopefully I choose not to sin, but it should be started from the beginning, so that it's flipped around, and that you make the free will decision to do something good or bad ahead of time of doing it.
Interesting. You've prompted me, though, since I'm on a soapbox here,
Yeah.
right? So posting the 10 Commandments in classrooms, I think we should make the decision, are we using the Hebrew version from Exodus or the Hebrew version from Deuteronomy? And of course, we're going to put it in the Hebrew, correct, in the classroom. Because why would we translate it? That seems like a flawed process. So, all right.
Yeah, Jack, that was very interesting talk. Years ago, I read the book Legends of the Bible, a Jewish book. I forget who the author was. Yeah, yeah. And okay. And I thought there was something in there about when does the soul enter the body, and this has to do with the abortion debate and all that. But in that book, in the Jewish tradition, it looks like when you are born, and then the soul enters. But then there's some predetermination, I think, that he was talking about, that your future is kind of determined when that happens. Was I interpreting that right?
I don't know about that piece, but you are correct that mainstream Judaism would argue that until the baby is born, it's not a human being. And if we think that ensoulment, whatever that means exactly, makes you a human being, then that process occurs at birth. I don't know that process, I don't think it differs from one person to another. I don't think they would be trying to say some people get their soul early or whatever, but maybe there's an element of predetermination in that. I don't know. But yeah, absolutely, the whole topic of abortion has some component that is hinging on that. And that's why Jewish attitudes about abortion are not necessarily, consonant with everybody else's attitude.
So, Jack, I have a question. It's I spend quite a bit of time visiting people in prison, so I got to know the kind of situations they grew up in. And when I'm thinking about free will, it makes me wonder how your background, how do you integrate your background, where you came from, for example, whether you were born, in a place where you were starving. How does that integrate with free will? Is there such a thing as limited free will?
Yeah, that's
I
an
don't know.
interesting question, Glenn. I think some of these philosophers do try to weaken the concept of free will. So in that sense, I think they're probably aligned with what you say of some sort of limited free will, or maybe Libet's free won't, right? That there's certain choices you can make to prevent what otherwise might seem ballistic, but it's hard. Yeah, I think that would be consonant with that.
Are you aware of the neuroscientist and pharmacologist Candace Pert? Because she actually was the one who discovered the opiate receptors in the brain. Some people think she should have won the Nobel Prize for that. But anyway, she was interviewed by Bill Moyers in 1995, and she was asked regarding free will. and she said she didn't know. And she was going to leave it at that, but she hoped her further research would maybe resolve the question. Unfortunately, she died in 2013. But she's a very important scientist. There's also, are you aware of Karl Popper? His work, and he references Hadamard. Hadamard is the mathematician who in 1898 had paper surfaces of negative curvature. It's a longer title than that in French, but it was the first example of chaos 2 years before Poincaré. And Karl Popper thinks that that paper might indicate possible free will.
Interesting. Yeah. I read a typo one time that you can go down a rabbi hole with all this stuff. And it's probably true, right? I mean, there's no end to what you can read on all this stuff. But yeah, no, thank you. I'll take a look at some of those.
Hi, one quick question. What does Judaism say about God's ability to see the future, even though it's not occurred yet?
Yeah, and I think this is the easy answer for almost all these things. Judaism is not a dogmatic set of traditions. It guides you on how to live your life. What you believe is kind of your business, because how do we know? So that's true on most of these existential questions, like what happens after I die, or why do bad things happen to good people? And we don't know. And so more important is to live your life as well as you can, and not get so wrapped around the axle trying to answer questions that we probably can't answer. And so I could tell you maybe what I think, but certainly not what Judaism would say, because there's no such thing as a monolithic answer.
What do you think?
So my theology is a very fuzzy theology, I have to tell you. And I think part of that is driven by having grown up, from the age of 4, wanting to be a natural scientist of one sort or another. I find it a little bit hard to be pinned down to say anything other than the idea of a God serves 2 important purposes in my mind. One is that it keeps us from getting too inflated, that there's something beyond us. I wear something on my head as a reminder there's something beyond me, right? I am not the be all and end all. That's one thing. And the other is living my life in accordance with this idea that there are consequences for my actions, and whether that's related to a God who judges, or just that, we should take into account that when we do something, it affects somebody else, and we don't want those to be adverse effects. That's about as theological as I get.
So of all the views on free will that you presented by the Jewish philosophers, which one is the one that you would hold dearest, or you would you could get behind?
Thank you. And I again want to thank Kirk for putting this all together, because I'm going to use that as a segue to the questions at the tables, which asks exactly that question, like what did you think was the one that sort of resonated? And maybe I'll circulate around while people are having their discussions.
All right. Thank you.